So I'm not even kidding here. Just like 15 seconds ago, I watched this video on Twitter with no context whatsoever. It's some security footage of somebody. I can't tell if it's a dude or a lady or what, but they're on a moped, looks like maybe in East Asia somewhere. And they pull into this intersection and they ram a bus. And they're like, oh, whoops. And some people come over and they're like, you okay? And they help them back up. And then the person pulls forward and they ram a car. And some people help them again and they back up and they just ram another bus head on. And they're okay, but they look pretty wobbly and they back up and they turn and just drive through this barricade into a pit and out of the shot. I don't know if they're okay. I don't know when this happened. Like I said, I have no context whatsoever, but I went to share it with my friend who, I mean, come on, we all have a friend like this who we send stuff to unsolicited that doesn't really make any sense whatsoever, but it's reflective of our internet travels. And I was like, what do I type? How do I even caption this? And I was like, the only explanation I can come up with here is a seizure or maybe demon possession. And I was like, oh, dang. Just like Matthew chapter 17. That's what I was thinking about this week on the TMBH podcast. That's what we run into here. We run into inexplicable human behavior where some people are looking at it and they're like, it looks like the guy's got seizures. Other people are looking at it and they're like, looks like that's probably demons. Jesus ultimately lands on the side of it's demons. But whatever the case, this dude in this story has been living with this condition, and I am even more empathetic to how overwhelming this must have been for the kid in question in this passage in Matthew 17, starting in verse 14 and running through 21. I'm even more empathetic to that kid and to his family after watching that inexplicable video, seeing somebody who I don't think wanted to harm themselves repeatedly harming themselves because something seemed to be going wrong between their brain and their body. So in Matthew 17, we've just wrapped up the transfiguration. God speaks to Peter and the other disciples. They're on their way down the mountain where they talk about what just happened and how the prophecies surrounding Elijah and the Messiah and John the Baptist all fit together. And as they come off the mountain, very much mirroring Matthew chapter 8, as they come off the mountain from the Sermon on the Mount, and again, like chapter 8, someone boldly approaches Jesus and requests a vicarious miracle for someone else about whom they are concerned. Verse 14, it says, when they, that's Jesus, James, John, and Peter, came to the crowd off of the mountain, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son. He said, he has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him. Oh, unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied. How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed from that moment. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, because you have so little faith. I tell you the truth, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it'll move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Last time around, and at the beginning of this episode, we broke down the condition this kid was dealing with a little bit. And then we got to this surprise response from Jesus. Everything about the formula for how the guy is approaching Jesus looks narratively and behaviorally like the kind of thing Jesus likes and responds really warmly to and has responded warmly to in the past. But here, he doesn't. So who is Jesus frustrated with here? The disciples or the dude? Or everybody in general? Well, here's the argument for he's frustrated with the disciples. If you're Jesus and you're in this situation and your disciples weren't able to do this, you look at them and you're like, what do you guys need to see in order to have enough faith to operate and to move ahead with this stuff that I imbued you with the power to do back in chapter 10 in the missional discourse? 3 of them, I mean, this is just minutes earlier, saw Jesus transfigured and shining with the glory of God. 3 of them, just minutes earlier, were hanging out with Moses and Elijah, who I'm pretty sure, though not an expert in history, had been dead for a super long time at this point. These guys have seen their own numbers walk on water. They've seen death turn into life. They've seen disease turn into health. They've seen disability turn into ability. They've seen nature bend the knee to their friend Jesus repeatedly. And so possibility number 1 for who Jesus is mad at is he's mad at the disciples. Like, come on. I mean, if that isn't enough, what would be enough? And I make Jesus sound like he's all frantic and upset and out of control. Sorry, I'm overacting there, but I think you get what I'm saying. So maybe Jesus is verbalizing correction toward his team right here and stressing to them that they have everything they need to move forward. Just move forward. You've been imbued with the ability to do this. Do it. If there's any impediment here, it's not because the skids aren't greased. It's not because everything isn't lined up in your favor and ability to do this. It is because of you and impediments that you guys are putting up. And why would you be putting them up? So that's possibility number one that I see here for who Jesus is expressing frustration with. And I think it's a pretty good possibility. Possibility number two is that he's mad at this guy. This guy comes up, he strikes the right pose, he says the right stuff, and it's possible that off screen here, this guy is motivated by something very different than the centurion of chapter 8 or the Canaanite woman of chapter 15. Maybe he just wants a favor and doesn't really believe in anything about Jesus, thinks he's a magic worker, but all of that's speculative because the text doesn't give us that at all. And if the lesson we were supposed to take from the text is that if you have this bad attitude, Jesus will rebuke you and not do your miracle thing, then I would think that Matthew would want to give us those details so we could know the formula and not make the mistake of the guy who was there after the Mount of Transfiguration event. But since none of that is in place, I don't think he's yelling at this guy. It looks more like this guy has gone up the chain like you or I would when we're on some kind of customer support call and we realize very quickly, okay, this lady does not have the ability to resolve my situation. Could I speak with a manager, please? And I understand that has some meme level connotations in 2019, 2020, 2021 in terms of the whole demand to speak with the manager thing. But come on, you do it when you call a call center. We know that you go up the escalating chain of authority to try to get to somebody who actually has the power to do the thing that needs to be obviously done to resolve the situation. So I don't think Jesus is mad at the guy for going up the chain of authority. It is possible, though, that what we're saying here further supports the idea that he is grouchy with his underlings, his disciples, who should have been able to handle the thing. I suppose the third possibility here is that this is an extension of the rebuke of the generation that Jesus has thrown out really since chapter 11 is the first time I can remember that happening. Remember, after the John the Baptist's disciples come and ask Jesus about things, he turns around and looks at the crowd and is like, what are y'all laughing at? And then he gets into it with the crowd and tells them why they're wrong. And he calls out some of their nonsense shared attitudes about like, hey, we played a flute for you, but you didn't dance. We sang a dirge and you didn't mourn. And he points out the hypocrisy of the crowds and then proclaims a whole bunch of woes to all of these people who've seen all this miraculous stuff, but they still don't believe, they still don't live like people whose brains should be transformed by having seen this miraculous stuff. That is a rebuke of an entire generation. I think he literally says, to what can I compare this generation in verse 16 of chapter 11, right before he gets into the dirge and dance quote that I gave you a minute ago. So there's that. Then there is the Matthew 12 and Matthew 16 dual references to the sign of Jonah. I think both of those open with Jesus calling them a wicked and adulterous generation. I'm looking for it in 12, scanning. Found it, verse 30. He answered, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign, but then none will be given it except for the sign of Jonah. And then we do the same dance steps over here at the beginning of 16. I know right where that is. So the Pharisees and Sadducees again come and they demand a miraculous sign, just like they did back in 12. And he says, red sky at night, sailor's delight, and all of that business. And then the end of all of that, you know how to interpret the sky. Verse 4, he says, a wicked and adulterous generation looks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. So it is possible now that for, by my count, the fourth time, what Jesus is doing here with this surprisingly negative response is he's talking about the inability of people, the disciples, the religious leaders, that guy, his kid. I don't know who he's directing it at specifically, but it's possible that this situation, going from the things that are transcendent and glorious down to the things that are crass and human, it looks as though this is causing it to be a front of mind issue, that he looks at the state of this whole generation. And while he still feels great compassion, I mean, he heals the kid. It's the same compassion he's had on display from the beginning. He's also to a place where, like, how much of this healing do I have to do before anybody's going to catch on? Like, there's just only so many places that you can go and only so many healings you can do. And at some point it's going to move the needle, or it's not going to move the needle. Harkening back to the chapter 13 kingdom parables discourse and the parable of the sower, like, the seed gets thrown out and some of it takes and most of it doesn't. What are you going to do? So based on the context of those three options, I feel pretty comfortable throwing out option number 2. Maybe you have thoughts on why I'm being too quick to dismiss that. I'd be all ears if you wanted to shoot me a note or say something over in the subreddit. You can do that. But options 1 and 3, or some combination of the two, to me seem the most likely here. The disciples are getting things wrong, and that is indicative of a larger getting it wronginess that is going on in the larger sense with this entire generation. And on that note, for the second straight day, I have looked at the time and decided that we are still not going to make it to the promised premise and outcome of 2 episodes ago. And I was like, hey, let's talk about this question of miracles and whether it's God that makes it happen in all circumstances, or if somehow God's miraculous behavior is relative to the attitudes of humans who are involved in the equation. We are going to get to it. I think we're finally getting there. Next time around, we will break that one down as we work through the rest of this passage. Thank you to every last one of you who has written a review of this podcast. I hadn't checked in on those for a while, and then I just went and did so. And golly, that's encouraging. You don't have to be that nice, but thank you. Tom F., Carl Tona, Trip 5248, Jumpin' Jim, Mama Duran, Scout Ranger Jr., Scott Osborne, Moj2K1, all of you. I read what you wrote. It was really, really nice. Thank you so much for the encouragement. That goes a long way. And weirdly, reviews put the podcast in front of other people. So for all of you who took the time to do that, it means a lot, not just because it's encouraging, but also because I'd like more people to be a part of the conversation, and that helps. There is one person I need to apologize to, and that is Beth Schrader, who on April 21st gave the podcast 3 stars and wrote, "Huh? ? Man, I am totally lost on this one. Sorry, Matt." I'm sorry you were lost too, Beth. I'm sorry for whatever my part was in the confusion, Beth. Still, thank you for leaving me a review, even if it was 3 out of 5 stars. Seriously, I appreciate you, Beth. I appreciate all of you. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. We will finish this line of thought next time around. It's going to be great. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.